My parents gave my inheritance to my sister after I worked overtime, so I left quietly and used the money to rebuild my entire life. I'm a 26-year-old guy who's always been the reliable one, the son who never said no when my parents or my younger sister needed help. That role wrapped around my identity so tightly that I stopped questioning where my life ended and their expectations began. I worked relentless overtime shifts, dragging my aching body home long after midnight, hands smelling like oil and disinfectant, just to place my paycheck on the kitchen counter like an offering. "You're such a good son," my mother would sigh, squeezing my shoulder, and I felt a dull pride bloom even as exhaustion hollowed me out inside. Every weekend I skipped plans, ignored texts, and watched friendships fade because there was always another bill, another repair, another emergency my sister couldn't handle alone. She'd flash a sweet smile and say, "You're the only one who understands me," while my parents nodded like that explained everything. I told myself this was love, that sacrifice meant loyalty, that someone had to be the strong one. Still, I couldn't ignore how they praised her for breathing while my efforts were treated like basic duty. Late at night, lying in my quiet room, I'd stare at the cracked ceiling and imagine the inheritance my father promised me, the future stability that would finally make this pain worth something. "One day, you'll be taken care of too," he reassured, his voice steady and distant, and I clung to those words like a lifeline. I believed my turn would come, that patience and obedience would earn security, respect, and peace. But lately, the way my sister laughed too confidently, and the way my parents avoided my eyes when money came up, made my chest tighten with an unease I couldn't explain, as if something invisible were already shifting beneath my feet. I'm a 26-year-old guy who started noticing the imbalance long before I had the courage to admit it out loud, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Every dinner felt like a quiet reminder of where I stood, my plate pushed aside while my sister's preferences were treated like royal demands. "She's just going through a lot," my mother would whisper whenever her moods dictated the entire household, as if my exhaustion didn't count for anything. I swallowed the bitterness and kept nodding, telling myself it was temporary, that things would even out if I just worked harder. I remember coming home one night, shoulders stiff and eyes burning, only to hear my father laugh proudly as he said, "Your sister's thinking of taking a break from her job, she deserves time to find herself." The words echoed in my chest because no one had ever offered me that kind of gentleness. Instead, my mother turned to me and said casually, "You're strong, you can handle it, you always do." I felt something crack quietly, like a hairline fracture spreading through a foundation I'd spent years reinforcing. The house even felt different, heavier somehow, the air thick with unspoken expectations and quiet comparison. I'd watch my sister scroll through her phone, freshly done nails tapping carelessly on the screen, while I sat across from her calculating how many extra hours I could squeeze out of my week. When I dared to mention how tired I felt, my father brushed it off with a tight smile and said, "You're not like her, you're dependable." It was meant as a compliment, but it landed like a cage locking around me. At night, the silence felt louder than any argument, my thoughts circling that haunting question of why love had to feel like slow self-erasure. I kept telling myself this was still my family, still my duty, still my place to endure, yet an uncomfortable truth kept creeping in, whispering that I wasn't valued, only used, and the way my parents exchanged uneasy looks whenever inheritance came up made my stomach twist with a quiet dread I couldn't name. I'm a 26-year-old guy who survived on one fragile thread of hope, the promise my father made that the inheritance would finally make all my sacrifices worth it. He said it so calmly one evening, stirring his tea like it was nothing serious, "You've carried us for years, son, that house money will be yours one day." Those words sank deep into me, becoming the quiet motivation behind every trembling muscle and sleepless night. I clung to that future like a secret reward, a silent reassurance that I wasn't just burning myself alive for nothing. Whenever exhaustion blurred my vision at work, I'd whisper that promise to myself, feeling its weight steady my shaking hands. I imagined a small apartment of my own, clean walls, soft lighting, a space where no one's needs eclipsed my own. "You're the smart one, you'll do great things," my mother said often, but her eyes never quite lingered on me long enough for it to feel real. They always darted back to my sister, whose life they cushioned with understanding and endless excuses. I remember bringing up the inheritance once more, carefully, as if it might shatter under pressure. "Dad, you still mean what you said, right?" He paused, lips tight, then nodded. "Of course, why wouldn't I?" But the way his hand trembled slightly and the way my mother shifted uncomfortably in her chair made my chest tighten. A small silence filled the room, thick and uneasy, like something hovering just out of sight. My sister scoffed lightly and said, "You worry too much, you're always so dramatic," her tone playful but edged with something sharper underneath. I laughed weakly, pretending it didn't sting, but inside, confusion twisted into quiet fear. The walls felt closer, the house colder, as if the air itself knew that the promise I'd built my survival on was starting to lose its foundation, and the more I sensed their hesitation, the more my heart whispered that something wasn't right, even as I tried desperately to believe it still was. I'm a 26-year-old guy who never imagined the ground could disappear beneath me so quietly, so casually, like my entire existence was just an accounting adjustment. It happened on an ordinary evening, the kind where the air smelled faintly of fried onions and the television murmured in the background, when my father cleared his throat and said, "We need to talk about the inheritance." My pulse spiked instantly, every nerve tightening as I sat straighter, already feeling dread coil in my stomach. "We've decided it's best if that money goes to your sister instead," he continued, eyes fixed on the coffee table, not on me. For a second, I couldn't even breathe. What are you talking about?" I stammered, my voice thin and unfamiliar. My mother reached for my arm like she was soothing a child and said, "She needs it more right now, you're strong, you can manage on your own." The room swayed slightly, the faded wallpaper blurring as my chest burned with something between shock and heartbreak. "You promised me," I whispered, my hands clenched so tight my nails dug into my skin. "You said that was for my future." My sister crossed her arms, lips curling into an almost bored smirk. "You're being selfish," she scoffed, "not everything is about you." That word, selfish, landed like a punch straight through my ribs, stealing whatever air I had left. I felt years of loyalty, overtime hours, and silent suffering collapsing in slow motion, like a building finally admitting it was never built for me. My father sighed heavily and said, "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," as if my entire world hadn't just been rewritten without my consent. The kitchen felt colder, the familiar tick of the clock suddenly deafening, each second stabbing deeper into my chest as they continued to justify their choice. I sat there frozen, disbelief mixing with humiliation, wondering how love could turn this sharp this fast, and as my sister avoided my gaze with quiet triumph, a terrifying thought crept in that this wasn't just a betrayal, but the beginning of something far worse still waiting to unfold. I'm a 26-year-old guy who learned that betrayal doesn't always come with raised voices, sometimes it arrives dressed as concern and wrapped in soft, manipulative smiles. After that night, the atmosphere in the house shifted, heavy and sour, like the smell of something rotting beneath polished furniture. My mother started whispering to relatives on the phone, her voice dripping with manufactured sadness. "He's just stressed, he doesn't understand how much his sister needs support right now," she'd say, glancing at me as if I were a difficult stranger. Every attempt I made to talk was twisted into an accusation against my character. "Why are you being so cold?" my father snapped when I tried to explain how deeply this had hurt me. I looked at him, heart pounding, and said, "You took my future after promising it to me," but he only shook his head tiredly and replied, "We raised you better than this, don't be greedy." My sister rolled her eyes dramatically and muttered, "He's always been dramatic, honestly," as if my pain were some inconvenient personality flaw. The words sank into me like slow poison, making me doubt my own reality. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I was selfish. That's what their voices kept echoing in my head while I lay awake at night listening to the faint creak of the hallway floorboards and the hum of the fridge down the corridor. The house that once felt like my only safe space now felt like a courtroom where I was always on trial, constantly defending emotions no one wanted to validate. When I tried to pull away, my mother caught me in the kitchen and said softly, "Don't let money come between family, you're better than that." Her hand rested on my arm, warm but heavy, and I felt my throat tighten with a confusion that tasted like metal. Every time I opened my mouth, their version of the story swallowed mine whole, leaving me shrinking further into silence, and the more they insisted I was the problem, the more a quiet, dangerous thought began forming in the back of my mind that maybe staying here was slowly destroying me. I'm a 26-year-old guy who finally realized the damage wasn't just emotional anymore, it was slowly carving pieces out of who I used to be. One night, after another round of tense silence and whispered side comments, I stood alone in the bathroom staring at my reflection, eyes sunken, jaw tight, and I barely recognized myself. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, cold and unforgiving, and for the first time it hit me that staying here wasn't loyalty anymore, it was self-destruction. That thought terrified me, but it also felt strangely freeing. When I walked back into the kitchen, my sister was laughing about redecorating her room with new money, and my mother smiled indulgently. "Isn't it nice she finally gets to enjoy life?" she said cheerfully, as if my sacrifice didn't exist at all. Something inside me clicked shut, like a door locking from the inside, quiet but final. I nodded politely and murmured, "Yeah, she deserves it," while my chest burned with a calm, focused anger I had never felt before. That night, as rain tapped against my bedroom window and the house settled into uneasy silence, I made a decision I didn't announce, didn't dramatize, and didn't even fully speak aloud. I would leave, not with tears or confrontation, but with careful silence and preparation. I began mentally listing everything I'd need: documents, savings, quiet plans, a life that no longer revolved around their approval. My heart still hurt, but beneath the ache, something sharper started to grow: clarity. The next morning, my father asked casually, "You okay now? You've been moody lately." I forced a small smile and said, "Yeah, just tired," while inside I was already pulling away from every emotional thread they had wrapped around me. The air felt different, like I could finally breathe a little deeper, even if the weight of what I was about to do pressed uncomfortably against my ribs. As they moved around the house like everything was normal, I felt like a ghost already haunting my own life, watching, waiting, quietly preparing to vanish, and the more they ignored my silence, the more certain I became that when I left, they wouldn't even see it coming. I'm a 26-year-old guy who thought I'd already hit my lowest point, but life has a way of proving you wrong when you think there's nothing left to break. It happened on a weekend afternoon when my sister burst into the living room, squealing with excitement, a glossy shopping bag dangling from her wrist. "Look what I bought," she chirped, pulling out expensive decorations and clothes, all clearly paid for with money that was never meant for her. My mother clapped her hands together, eyes shining with pride. "She finally gets to live a little," she said warmly, then glanced at me as if daring me to react. My chest tightened so painfully it felt like someone had wrapped barbed wire around my lungs. "You really don't see what you're doing, do you?" I murmured, voice trembling despite my attempts to stay calm. My father's face hardened immediately. "Don't start again," he warned, his tone sharp and impatient. My sister scoffed and rolled her eyes. "God, you're exhausting," she snapped. "You always act like the world owes you something. Maybe that's why you're miserable." The room blurred, my vision swimming as humiliation, anger, and heartbreak collided all at once. I felt exposed, reduced, and utterly invisible in my own home, like my pain was an inconvenience nobody wanted to acknowledge. "After everything I gave up for this family," I whispered, voice cracking, "you still think I'm the problem?" My mother sighed dramatically and said, "We're tired of your attitude, you're ruining the peace in this house." That sentence crushed what little strength I had left. The word peace echoed ironically in my head while my entire world crumbled around me. I retreated to my room, closing the door softly, pressing my forehead against the cool wood as tears finally slipped down my face in silence. My heart felt hollow, like a room stripped of all furniture and warmth, and in that suffocating stillness, a single, terrifying realization sank in with absolute clarity: I wasn't just unwanted here. I was actively disposable, and the people who were supposed to love me most had already erased me long before I realized it. And as their laughter floated faintly through the hallway behind me, something inside my chest shattered completely, leaving behind a dangerous, unfamiliar calm that told me the next step I took would change everything forever. I'm a 26-year-old guy who stopped crying the morning after that breakdown, not because the pain vanished, but because something colder and steadier took its place. The house still smelled like burned coffee and cheap air freshener, but I moved through it with a new kind of purpose, quiet and calculating. I stopped arguing, stopped explaining, stopped reacting, and that alone seemed to unsettle them more than any confrontation ever could. "You're finally acting normal again," my mother said with cautious relief, and I forced a faint smile that tasted like iron. Inside, I was already building a different life, one silent decision at a time. I began tucking away small amounts of my paycheck into a separate account, deleting transaction notifications the moment they appeared. Late at night, hunched over my phone under the dim glow of my desk lamp, I researched apartments, job upgrades, and budgeting plans like a man studying his own escape route. My fingers trembled as I scrolled, not from fear, but from the strange thrill of realizing my future no longer belonged to their approval. At dinner, my sister bragged loudly about her next shopping spree. "I deserve this after everything I've been through," she announced dramatically. I nodded without expression and muttered, "Yeah, sounds nice," feeling their eyes linger on me, suspicious of my sudden calm. My father narrowed his gaze slightly and said, "You seem different lately." I shrugged lightly. "Just trying to focus on myself for once," I replied, and the silence that followed was thick and uneasy. In my room, I started sorting through my few personal belongings, choosing what I would take and what I'd leave behind like shedding old skin. The air felt cooler, lighter, every breath a quiet statement of rebellion. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a servant to their expectations, but a man quietly reclaiming control over his own existence. Still, as empowering as it felt, there was an edge of fear wrapping around that hope, a tension pulsing just beneath the surface. Because the more distant I became, the more alert they seemed, and I could feel it clearly now, their growing awareness that I was slipping beyond their control, and they weren't going to let that happen without trying to pull me back in. I'm a 26-year-old guy who never expected the next blow to come wrapped in whispered confessions and accidental honesty. It started when my aunt cornered me outside the house one evening, the air humid and thick with the scent of wet pavement. "I didn't want to get involved," she murmured, eyes darting nervously, "but you deserve to know your parents are struggling, badly." My stomach dropped instantly, the words sinking into me like cold water. "They already burned through half of what they gave your sister," she continued, voice low and heavy with concern. "Late mortgage payments, credit cards, loans they never told you about. They thought giving her the inheritance would somehow fix things." The world tilted slightly, and for a moment, I just stood there, stunned by the irony choking the back of my throat. They hadn't just betrayed me emotionally, they'd gambled everything away while preaching responsibility to me. When I walked back inside, the house felt different, like the walls were hiding secrets in their peeling paint. My father sat at the table shuffling unpaid bills, his shoulders tense, jaw stiff. My sister paced, phone pressed to her ear. "No, I need that money," she snapped angrily, her voice sharp and desperate. I watched silently, piecing the puzzle together as realization burned through my chest like slow fire. Later that night, my mother knocked softly on my door, her expression tight and forced. "We might need a little help," she said carefully, lips trembling just enough to show fear. "Just until things stabilize." The audacity almost made me laugh. After stripping me of my future, they now came crawling back to the son they dismissed and drained dry. I stared at her, feeling a strange surge of power settle over me. "You said I was strong enough on my own, remember?" I replied calmly, watching her flinch slightly at the reminder. I could see the panic behind her eyes now, the quiet realization that their safety net had finally grown teeth. As I closed the door slowly, my heart beat with a controlled intensity I'd never known before. The roles were shifting, and for the first time, I wasn't the one begging to be seen, and judging by the nervous whispers filling the hallway outside, they were finally starting to understand just how much they'd lost when they pushed me too far. I'm a 26-year-old guy who felt something almost surreal settle over me as their desperation slowly replaced the authority I'd feared my whole life. The following evening, my parents asked me to sit with them at the dining table, the same table where they'd so casually rewritten my future. The light above flickered softly, casting pale shadows on their tense faces, and the air felt unnaturally still. "We just want to talk," my father said carefully, fingers tapping nervously against the worn wood. My sister sat nearby, arms crossed, eyes restless, her earlier confidence replaced by quiet irritation. "This whole situation is getting ridiculous," she muttered, avoiding my gaze. My mother folded her hands tightly and whispered, "We need your understanding right now," her voice trembling with forced calm. I watched them all, studying the cracks in the very people who once made me feel small, and something inside me remained surprisingly steady. "I didn't understand when you took my inheritance," I said evenly, my voice low but controlled. "But you understood just fine when you said I'd manage on my own." The silence that followed pressed heavily against the walls, thick with discomfort. My father cleared his throat and muttered, "We made a difficult choice as parents," while my sister scoffed, "You're acting like a victim again." I leaned back slowly, heart pounding but posture calm, and met their eyes without flinching. "No," I replied quietly, "I just finally stopped pretending this was normal." My mother's lips parted slightly, her expression flickering between guilt and frustration. "We're still your family," she insisted, reaching halfway toward me before stopping, unsure if it was safe. "And yet," I murmured, my tone firm, "you only seem to remember that when you need something from me." Their discomfort was visible now, like a thin layer of panic under their forced composure. I could see the shift happening. The moment they realized my silence wasn't surrender, it was withdrawal. As I stood slowly from the table, the chair scraping softly against the floor, my sister hissed under her breath, "Where do you think you're going?" I paused, back still turned to them, feeling the weight of their eyes tightening around me, and for the first time, I didn't feel trapped by it at all, only aware that whatever choice I made next would leave them shaking in its wake. I'm a 26-year-old guy who realized that night that walking away didn't have to be loud to be powerful. The hallway felt narrower as I moved toward my room, their eyes burning into my back like hooks trying to drag me into the past again. My sister's voice followed me, sharp and irritated, "You think you're better than us now, huh?" I didn't turn around, but the words still scraped against something raw inside my chest. Inside my room, the air smelled faintly of dust and old fabric, familiar yet suddenly foreign, like I'd already outgrown this space. My mother knocked softly, the sound hesitant, almost respectful for the first time in years. "Please," she whispered through the door, "we didn't mean to hurt you like this." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of every sleepless night, every ignored boundary, every silent sacrifice settling heavy in my bones. "You did," I replied quietly, staring at the cracked edge of my dresser, my voice trembling just slightly. "And you kept doing it even after I begged you to stop." The silence stretched painfully, thick with things they'd never admit and words I'd never hear. My father finally spoke, his tone strained and distant, "We're still your parents, you don't just abandon family." A bitter laugh slipped from my lips before I could stop it. "You abandoned me long before tonight," I said, my throat tightening as the truth settled in with brutal clarity. The realization didn't feel dramatic, it felt hollow, like something carefully uprooted after years of decay. I began packing slowly, folding each piece of clothing with deliberate calm, listening to the creak of the old wardrobe and the muffled tension in the hallway beyond. My sister muttered angrily, "He's being dramatic again," but her voice wavered, no longer sharp with certainty, just edged with fear. I zipped my bag closed, the sound echoing slightly, and glanced around the room one last time, memorizing the chipped paint, the faded posters, the life I was finally choosing to leave behind. As I stepped toward the door, keys curling tightly in my palm, my mother's shadow shifted just outside, and I hesitated for a split second, caught between the familiar ache of guilt and the unfamiliar strength of self-respect, because once I walked past that doorway, I knew nothing would ever return to how it once was, and the silence waiting on the other side felt both terrifying and strangely freeing at the same time. I'm a 26-year-old guy who stepped out into the cool night air with my bag slung over my shoulder and felt a strange mix of grief and relief wash through me. The street lamp flickered softly, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement, and every breath felt sharper, cleaner, like the world had finally given me permission to exist. My phone buzzed with angry messages and trembling apologies, but I didn't open a single one, just let the vibration fade into the quiet. "You'll regret this," my father's voice echoed in my memory, yet even that no longer had the power to chain my feet to the doorway. In the days that followed, I found a tiny apartment that smelled faintly of fresh paint and dust, nothing fancy, but it was mine. I remember sitting on the bare floor, my back against the wall, listening to the distant hum of traffic while my thoughts replayed every cruel word, every broken promise. "You always make things harder than they need to be," my mother used to say, and I realized now how much I'd wasted trying to make things easier for people who never valued me. The silence felt lonely, but it also felt honest, like I wasn't constantly shrinking to fit into someone else's comfort. At work, exhaustion still clung to me, but now it was different, almost purposeful. I wasn't grinding myself down for their approval anymore, I was building something for my own survival. Late at night, as the city lights glowed faintly through my small window, I let the emotions come, the anger, the sadness, the betrayal, all of it crashing through me like waves. But for the first time, I didn't drown in them. I just let them wash over and recede, leaving behind clarity instead of suffocation. My sister called once, her voice tight and unfamiliar. "So that's it? You're just done with us," she hissed, and I stared at the chipped corner of my new desk, feeling a calm settle inside me. "I'm done being your safety net," I replied quietly, and the line went dead. As I lay on my thin mattress that night, staring up at a ceiling that belonged only to me, I realized something quietly powerful had shifted. I wasn't running anymore, and I wasn't begging to be loved. I was finally choosing myself, and even though the future still felt uncertain and fragile, there was something steady beating in my chest now, a quiet strength I'd never known, whispering that this wasn't the end of my story, but the beginning of something I was still learning how to claim.